Frank Sullivan stood in the doorway of room 247 at Sunset Hills Assisted Living, looking at the space that would now be his entire world. 12 by 15 feet, one window, a twin bed that wasn't his bed, a chair that wasn't his chair, a bathroom with grab bars and an emergency pull cord that screamed, "Old person lives here." He was 67 years old, and his life had just been packed into a 10 by 10 storage unit across town. "Dad, it's nice, right?" His daughter Jennifer was using that bright, false voice people use when they're trying to convince you that something terrible is actually wonderful. "Look, you can see the garden from your window, and there's a TV, and the bathroom is right here, so you don't have to walk far." "I don't want to be here." Jennifer's smile faltered. "I know, but after the fall, after we found you on the floor for 6 hours before anyone checked on you, Dad, we can't take that risk again. What if next time you hit your head? What if—" "I'm not an invalid. I fell because the floor was wet, not because I'm falling apart. You have arthritis in both knees. You have high blood pressure. You're on 8 medications. And you live alone in a 2-story house where you can't even reach the 2nd floor anymore." Jennifer's voice cracked. "Please, Dad. Please just try. For me. For the kids. We need to know you're safe." Frank wanted to argue, but he was too tired, and Jennifer was right, even if he didn't want to admit it. After Susan died 3 years ago, the house had become too big, too quiet, too full of memories. He'd been managing, or so he thought, until the fall, until the 6 hours on the kitchen floor, unable to reach his phone, his hips screaming in pain, wondering if this was how it ended. Alone, in an empty house, waiting for someone to notice he was missing. "What about Winston?" Frank asked, looking down at the elderly Corgi sitting patiently at his feet. Winston was 13 years old, with a grey muzzle, cloudy eyes, and arthritis that matched Frank's limp for limp. He'd been Susan's dog originally. She'd gotten him as a puppy right after her cancer diagnosis, saying she needed something to care for, something to make her feel useful when the treatments made her feel like a burden. Winston had outlived Susan by 3 years. Now he was all Frank had left of his wife, and he'd told Jennifer in no uncertain terms. He wasn't going anywhere without the dog. Jennifer bit her lip. "They said you can keep him. But Dad, there are rules. He can't bark, can't disturb other residents, can't have accidents if there are complaints." "There won't be complaints. Winston's a good dog." "I know, but he's old too, Dad. Maybe it would be better if—" "No." Frank's voice was hard. "I'm not giving up my dog. That's non-negotiable." Jennifer sighed. Okay. Just be careful, okay? Don't give them any reason to ask you to get rid of him." After Jennifer left, Frank sat in his new chair in his new room with Winston at his feet and tried not to cry. He'd spent 42 years building a life with Susan. They'd raised 3 kids in that house. They'd hosted Thanksgiving dinners and birthday parties. They'd fought and laughed and grown old together in those rooms. And now it was all gone, sold to a young couple who'd probably paint over Susan's carefully chosen colors and tear out the garden she'd spent decades cultivating. "It's just you and me now, buddy," Frank said to Winston. The Corgi looked up at him with those cloudy eyes and wagged his tail once, slowly. "We're going to make this work, okay? We have to." If this story of an old man, his loyal Corgi, and the unexpected purpose they found in the last place they wanted to be moves you, please subscribe to Second Chance Stories and hit that notification bell. What unfolds at Sunset Hills will challenge everything you think you know about aging, about value, and about the heroes hiding in the most unexpected places. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Frank Sullivan had been an architect for 40 years. He'd designed schools and libraries and community centers, buildings meant to serve people, to create spaces where life happened. He'd been good at his work, respected, successful enough to provide well for his family. But retirement had been harder than he'd expected. Without the structure of work, without the projects and deadlines and purpose, he'd felt unmoored. Susan had still been alive then, and she'd kept them busy with travel and grandkids and her endless projects. But after she died, the purposelessness had become unbearable. Frank had thought maybe he'd volunteer somewhere, take up woodworking, find some new passion. Instead, he'd just existed. Days blurred together. He stopped shaving regularly, stopped cooking real meals, stopped seeing friends because it was too hard to explain that he was just waiting to die. The fall had been almost a relief. At least it was something happening, something that required action and decisions and movement. At least it meant his family was paying attention again. Now, at Sunset Hills, Frank was surrounded by other people doing the same thing he was, waiting. Waiting for meals, waiting for medication, waiting for visits from family, waiting for the end. The first week was hell. Frank hated the communal meals, where residents sat at assigned tables and made small talk about their medications and their children's lives. He hated the activities coordinator who treated them all like kindergartners. He hated the nurses who were kind but rushed, the doctors who talked to him like he was slightly stupid, the whole infantilizing nightmare of being old in a place designed to keep old people alive but not necessarily living. The only good thing was Winston. The Corgi had adjusted better than Frank had. Winston seemed to understand that this was their life now, and he made the best of it. He greeted the staff with tail wags, charmed the residents who encountered him in the hallway, and spent his evenings curled up on Frank's bed, providing the only real comfort Frank had. But then Winston started misbehaving. It started in week 2. Frank woke at 2 a.m. to find Winston missing from his bed. The door to the room was closed, so the dog should have been there. Panicking, Frank got up, slowly, his arthritis worse at night, and opened the door to the hallway. Winston was 10 doors down, sitting outside room 273, whining softly. "Winston," Frank hissed, "get back here. You're going to wake people up." But Winston wouldn't budge. He scratched at the door, whined louder, looked back at Frank with obvious distress. "I don't know what you want, but we can't be out here in the middle of the night. Come on." Finally, Frank had to pick Winston up and carry him back to their room. The Corgi was agitated for the rest of the night, pacing and whining until Frank was ready to scream. The next morning, Frank learned that the woman in room 273, Margaret Chen, a retired teacher, had suffered a stroke during the night. The aide who found her at 6 a.m. said it looked like it had happened several hours earlier, but because Margaret was already at the facility, they'd gotten her to the hospital quickly. She'd survived with minimal damage. Frank felt a chill. Winston had been at Margaret's door at 2 a.m., hours before the aide's rounds. It had to be coincidence. 3 days later, it happened again. Frank woke to find Winston gone. Found him outside room 281, same behavior, whining, scratching, refusing to leave. Frank dragged the dog back to bed. In the morning, the resident from room 281, Harold Jackson, was found in diabetic shock. His blood sugar had dropped dangerously low during the night. He survived because the morning aide found him during early rounds. Frank started to pay attention. The third incident got him called to the director's office. Winston had escaped at 3 a.m., had been found outside room 295, and his barking had woken up half the floor. Director Patricia Hayes was a stern woman in her 50s who ran Sunset Hills with military efficiency. "Mr. Sullivan, we've had multiple complaints about your dog. Residents can't sleep when he's barking in the hallway in the middle of the night. I don't know how he's getting out. I closed the door." That's not the point. The point is that your dog is disturbing other residents. We made an exception allowing him here because you insisted, but that exception comes with conditions. If this continues, we'll have no choice but to ask you to rehome him. Please, I'll figure out how to keep him in the room. See that you do. One more incident and the dog goes. I'm sorry, but we have to think of all our residents, not just you. Frank left the office feeling sick. He couldn't lose Winston. The dog was all he had left. That night, Frank tried everything to keep Winston in the room. He moved a chair in front of the door. He stayed awake as long as he could. But at some point around midnight, exhaustion won, and he dozed off. He woke at 2:30 a.m. to find Winston gone and the chair pushed aside. His heart sinking. Frank went to the hallway and found Winston, predictably, outside another resident's door, room 289. "Winston, please. They're going to take you away from me. Please, buddy, we can't do this." But Winston wouldn't move. He was fixated on that door with an intensity Frank had never seen in him. Frank stood in the hallway in his pajamas, trying to decide what to do. Should he knock on the door? Check on whoever was in there? Call for help? Or just drag Winston back and hope for the best? He was still debating when the door opened. A nurse, one of the night shift workers, came out looking startled. "Mr. Sullivan, is this your dog?" "Yes. I'm so sorry he got out again. He's been scratching at the door for 5 minutes. I thought I should check on Mr. Morrison, make sure he hadn't called for help, and we'd missed it somehow. Is he okay?" The nurse's face was grave. "No, actually. His color's wrong, his breathing's shallow. I'm calling for an ambulance right now. If we hadn't checked on him..." She looked down at Winston. "How did your dog know?" Frank had no answer. Mr. Morrison survived. He'd been having a heart attack. If the nurse hadn't checked on him when she did, he would have died in his sleep. The next morning, Frank went back to Patricia Hayes' office without being summoned. "I know you're going to make me get rid of Winston, but before you do, I need to tell you something. He's not misbehaving. He's detecting medical emergencies. 4 times now, he's alerted to residents who were having crises during the night. Margaret Chen's stroke, Harold Jackson's diabetic episode, Louise Henderson's seizure. That was room 295. And now, Mr. Morrison's heart attack. Every single person Winston alerted to had a medical emergency within hours." Patricia looked skeptical. "That's quite a claim, Mr. Sullivan." "It's not a claim. It's documented. Check your records. Check the times. Winston was at their doors hours before anyone else knew something was wrong. Dogs can't predict medical emergencies. Actually, they can. I looked it up last night. There are dogs trained to detect seizures, diabetic episodes, even cancer. They can smell chemical changes in the body that happen before symptoms become obvious. Winston isn't trained, or at least I don't think he is, but he's doing it anyway." Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Even if that's true, he's still disturbing residents. Because no one believes him. He's trying to alert people to danger, and everyone's ignoring him. Of course he's getting more agitated. Frank leaned forward. Give me 2 weeks. Let me document everything. Let me prove he's saving lives. And if I'm wrong, if he's just being disruptive, I'll rehome him. But please, just give us a chance to show you what he can do." Patricia clearly thought Frank was a delusional old man clinging to his dog. But she also had 4 residents who'd survived medical emergencies because they'd been in a facility with 24-hour care when those emergencies occurred. 2 weeks, she said finally. Document everything. But Mr. Sullivan, if he disturbs residents again, without a medical emergency to justify it, he's gone immediately. Understood? Understood. Frank went back to his room and looked at Winston, who was sleeping peacefully on the bed. "You're either a genius or I'm going crazy, buddy. Let's hope it's the first one." Over the next week, Frank became Winston's shadow. He tracked the dog's behavior obsessively, noting when Winston became restless, where he wanted to go, how he acted. He bought a cheap notebook and created a log. Day 8. Winston agitated at 11 p.m. Pacing. Wanted to go to hallway. I followed him to room 302. Winston sat outside door for 20 minutes. At 6 a.m., resident found to have severe UTI with fever of 103. Day 10. Winston restless at 1 a.m. Led me to room 278. Scratched at door. Alerted night nurse. Resident was having allergic reaction to new medication. Caught before, became life-threatening. Day 12. Winston calm all night. No alerts, no emergencies. The pattern became undeniable. Winston could detect when residents were in medical distress, sometimes hours before symptoms became obvious to humans. He wasn't 100% accurate. There were a few false alarms where Winston alerted, but no emergency was found. But he was right, more often than not. And when he was right, he was saving lives. Frank started keeping Winston off-leash at night, with permission slipped under doors of nearby residents. "My dog Winston may alert to medical emergencies. If he comes to your door, please call the front desk immediately. He might be detecting something wrong." Most residents thought Frank was eccentric, but harmless. A few were intrigued. One of those was Eleanor Rosewood in room 251. Eleanor was 82, a former nurse who'd worked in emergency rooms for 40 years. She'd been at Sunset Hills for 6 months after a hip replacement that hadn't healed well. Frank met her properly 2 weeks into his documentation project. He was in the common room with Winston when Eleanor sat down across from them. "Your dog is causing quite a stir, Mr. Sullivan." "Frank, please, and yes, I'm aware. The staff thinks you're crazy. They're humoring you because Patricia feels guilty about threatening to take away an old man's dog." "I know, but I'm not crazy. Winston is detecting medical emergencies." Eleanor looked at Winston with professional assessment. "I believe you. I've seen medical alert dogs before. Usually they're trained from puppies, specifically bred and conditioned for it. But occasionally you get a dog with natural talent who just knows. I think Winston is one of those." Frank felt a surge of relief. Finally, someone who didn't think he was delusional. "Can you help me prove it?" "I can do better than that. I can help you train him. Right now he's alerting, but it's chaotic. He's distressing residents because he doesn't know how to communicate what he's sensing. But if we can teach him a specific alert behavior, something calm and clear, the staff might actually start listening to him." "How do we do that?" "We start by reinforcing the behavior we want. Every time he alerts correctly, we reward him immediately. We teach him that sitting quietly at a door gets better results than scratching and barking. We make him a partner in care, not a disruption." Eleanor became Frank's unexpected ally. Together, they worked with Winston, refining his alert behavior. Within a week, Winston had learned that sitting calmly at a door and speaking once, a soft bark, would bring humans to investigate. The frantic scratching and whining stopped. The staff noticed the change. Even Patricia had to admit that Winston was disturbing residents less, even as he continued his nightly rounds. But not everyone was happy about Winston's activities. One person in particular seemed determined to discredit Frank and get rid of the dog. Michael Bradley was a nurse's aide who'd worked at Sunset Hills for 3 years. He was in his 30s, always friendly to residents' faces, but complained constantly to other staff about the entitled old people who couldn't accept that their best days were behind them. Frank had heard him making jokes about residents in the medication room, laughing about their confusion or their complaints. Michael seemed especially hostile to Winston. He'd filed 2 of the official complaints about the dog, claiming Winston had attacked him in the hallway, Winston had barked at him once, and that the dog was a health hazard that should never have been allowed in the facility. "That guy hates me," Frank told Eleanor one afternoon. "He hates that you're getting attention," Eleanor corrected. "Michael likes to be the center of things, likes residents to depend on him and be grateful. Your dog is getting more respect from staff than he is. He's jealous." Frank thought that was ridiculous until he overheard Michael talking to another aide in the break room. "That old man and his dog are making us look bad, like we need some mutt to do our jobs. It's insulting. I'm telling Patricia that either the dog goes or I quit, and I've been here 3 years. They're not going to pick some senile resident and his pet over me." Frank felt his stomach drop. Michael had influence with staff. If he made it an ultimatum, Patricia might decide Winston was more trouble than he was worth. That night, Winston alerted to room 267. Frank followed his protocol. Winston sat at the door, barked once, and Frank immediately called the night nurse. They found the resident, Martha Riley, disoriented and feverish. She had pneumonia that came on fast, and getting her to the hospital early made all the difference. But when Frank went back to his room, he found Michael waiting in his hallway. "You need to stop this," Michael said, his friendly mask completely gone. "This whole act with your dog, it's making everyone uncomfortable. Winston is saving lives. Winston is a dog. Dogs don't predict medical emergencies. You're just getting lucky, and you're making staff second-guess themselves every time that mutt barks. Do you know how that affects morale? Do you know how much harder it makes our jobs when residents are asking why we didn't notice what a dog noticed? Maybe because you're not paying enough attention." Michael's face darkened. "You're going to regret this, old man. You and your dog are going to be out of here so fast. Is there a problem here?" Eleanor had appeared at her door, looking between them with sharp eyes. Michael's friendly mask slipped back into place. "No problem, Mrs. Rosewood. Just checking on Mr. Sullivan and his dog, making sure everything's okay." After Michael left, Eleanor pulled Frank into her room. "That man is dangerous. I've seen his type before. Charming to the right people. Cruel when no one's looking. You need to be careful. He's threatening to get me kicked out. Then we need to make sure Patricia sees Winston's value before Michael can undermine you." They worked on a presentation. 3 weeks of documented alerts, medical records showing Winston's accuracy rate, research on medical detection dogs, testimonials from residents whose lives had been saved. Eleanor used her nursing background to make it credible, citing studies and statistics. They scheduled a meeting with Patricia for the following Monday. But on Sunday night, something happened that changed everything. Winston alerted at 1:30 a.m. He was more agitated than usual, pacing and whining before finally leading Frank to the door. But instead of going to a residence room, Winston led Frank toward the medication room. "That's off limits, buddy. We can't go in there." But Winston was insistent. He sat at the medication room door and barked, not his usual soft, alert bark, but loud, urgent barking that would wake the whole floor. Frank tried to shush him, terrified this would be the incident that got Winston kicked out. But then the door opened from inside, and Michael emerged with a backpack that looked suspiciously full. Michael froze when he saw Frank. "What are you doing here?" Winston was alerting. "What are you doing in the medication room at 1:30 in the morning?" "My job. Sometimes we have to restock during night shift." But Michael's voice was defensive, and he was holding that backpack like it contained something valuable. Winston was going crazy now, barking at Michael, at the backpack, trying to get past Frank to the door. "What's in the bag, Michael?" "None of your business, old man. Get your dog under control before I call security." But Frank's architect brain was good at patterns, good at noticing when things didn't fit. Michael's defensiveness, the backpack, the medication room in the middle of the night. Winston's unprecedented level of agitation. "You're stealing medications, aren't you?" Michael's face went cold. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Winston's been alerting to you, not to residents having emergencies, to you, because he can smell whatever drugs you're taking, because you're the threat he's been trying to warn people about." It happened fast. Michael grabbed Frank's arm hard enough to hurt and shoved him against the wall. "Listen to me, you senile old fool. You're going to forget you saw me here. You're going to take your dog back to your room. And you're not going to say a word to anyone, because if you do, I'll make sure everyone knows you're having delusions. I'll tell them you've been wandering at night, confused, making up stories. They'll put you in memory care so fast, and your dog will be put down for attacking me. Do you understand?" Frank was 67, arthritic and scared, but he was also angry. Angry at being called senile, angry at being threatened, angry at 3 years of being treated like he was less than human just because he was old. "Get your hands off me!" "Or what? You'll tell on me. Who do you think they'll believe? A respected employee or a lonely old man who thinks his dog is magic?" Winston solved the problem by biting Michael's leg. Not a serious bite, just enough to get him to let go of Frank. Michael cursed, kicked at Winston, missed. The dog dodged and kept barking, that urgent alarm bark that echoed down the hallway. Lights started coming on in rooms. Doors opened. Residents emerged to see what the commotion was, and among them was Eleanor, who took one look at the scene. Michael with the backpack, Frank against the wall, Winston barking, and pulled out her cell phone. "I'm calling the police." "You're all crazy," Michael said, but there was panic in his eyes now. He tried to walk away, but Frank, finding courage he didn't know he had, grabbed the backpack. They struggled. The bag fell. Pill bottles scattered across the hallway floor, dozens of them, all with residents' names on the labels: oxycodone, Vicodin, Xanax, Ambien. A pharmacy's worth of controlled substances stolen from the very people who needed them. Michael ran, but Sunset Hills was a secure facility, and he didn't get past the front door before security stopped him. The police investigation over the next week revealed the full scope of Michael's operation. He'd been stealing medications from residents for 2 years, replacing their pills with placebos or reducing dosages. That's why some residents had been experiencing increased pain, why some had worse symptoms than expected. They weren't getting the medication they thought they were getting. Michael had been selling the drugs online, making thousands of dollars, while elderly residents suffered. And when some residents had died, attributed to natural causes, to age, to expected decline. No one had thought to check if they'd been getting their actual medications. The facility faced lawsuits. Patricia Hayes was replaced. The entire medication protocol was overhauled, and Frank Sullivan and his Corgi Winston became local heroes. The news coverage was intense. Elderly dog exposes medication theft at assisted living facility. Hero Corgi saves lives while human staff looked away. 67-year-old and his dog protect vulnerable elderly from abuse. Frank hated the attention, but he loved what came after. A veterinary behaviorist from the university contacted him, wanting to study Winston. "I've seen medical alert dogs before, but never one with this broad range of detection abilities. Most dogs specialize, seizure alert or diabetic alert. But Winston seems to detect multiple types of medical emergencies. Plus, he detected the stress hormones of someone engaged in criminal activity. He's extraordinary." The testing confirmed what Frank had observed. Winston had an exceptional sense of smell and an unusual talent for detecting chemical changes associated with medical distress. He wasn't 100% accurate, but he was accurate enough to be valuable. "Have you ever considered training other dogs to do what Winston does?" the behaviorist asked. "There are thousands of assisted living facilities in this country. Most can't afford medical alert dogs, but if we could train shelter dogs, older dogs that people don't usually want, and place them in facilities like Sunset Hills, we could save thousands of lives." Frank had never thought of himself as someone who started movements. But at 67, with his old dog and his tiny room at Sunset Hills, he found himself at the center of one. The Winston Protocol, they called it. A program to train senior dogs, dogs over 8 years old, dogs with gray muzzles and arthritis, dogs that shelters struggled to adopt out, as medical alert companions for assisted living facilities. The dogs didn't need to be perfectly trained. They just needed to have the instinct, the sensitivity, the ability to notice what humans missed. Eleanor became the program's first medical advisor. Frank became the spokesperson, the face of the movement, and Winston became the program's mascot and proof of concept. Within a year, the Winston Protocol had placed 15 dogs in facilities across 3 states. Every single one saved at least one life in their first 6 months. Some saved many more. But the program wasn't just about the residents. It was about the dogs too. Senior dogs who'd been in shelters for months, who'd been passed over because people wanted puppies. Now they had jobs, purpose, respect. They were heroes instead of charity cases. And it was about people like Frank, residents who'd been warehoused, treated like they were already dead, just waiting for their bodies to catch up. Now, they had purpose too. Many became dog handlers, caring for the alert dogs, working with them, giving them meaning beyond just waiting to die. Frank got calls from facilities across the country. "Can you help us start a program? Can Winston visit our residents? Can you train our staff?" At 68, Frank was busier than he'd been in retirement. He split his time between Sunset Hills and traveling to speak at conferences, to train staff, to evaluate dogs for the program. Eleanor traveled with him when her health allowed, lending medical credibility to their work. Winston, now 14, was semi-retired from active alerting. But he still made his rounds at Sunset Hills, visiting residents, providing comfort, showing the new alert dogs how it was done. On the 1-year anniversary of catching Michael Bradley, Sunset Hills held a ceremony. They'd renamed the common room Winston's Room and commissioned a painting of the elderly Corgi that now hung on the wall. Patricia Hayes' replacement, director James Wong, gave a speech. "A year ago, We almost made a terrible mistake. We almost threw out an old man and his dog because they were inconvenient, because they didn't fit our rules, because we thought we knew better. Instead, that old man and that dog exposed a criminal operation that was harming our residents. They showed us that we'd been so focused on efficiency and protocol that we'd stopped really seeing the people in our care. Winston didn't just save individual lives, he saved this facility's soul. Frank stood to speak, Winston at his feet. The dog was moving slower now, his arthritis worse, his hearing fading. But his eyes were still bright, still alert, still watching the people around him for signs of distress. "When I came here a year ago, I thought my life was over," Frank said. "I thought I was just marking time until I died. I had no purpose, no value. I was just an old man taking up space. Winston was just an old dog nobody wanted. Together, we were invisible. Less than nothing." He looked around the room at the residents, many of whom he now knew by name, many of whom had become friends. But it turns out we had a lot to offer. We just needed someone to pay attention. We needed someone to believe that being old didn't mean being useless, that having arthritis didn't mean having nothing left to give. His voice grew stronger. "We throw people away in this country. We throw old people into facilities and forget about them. We throw old dogs into shelters and euthanize them because nobody wants them. We act like age is a disease instead of an accomplishment, like surviving is something to be ashamed of instead of celebrated." Winston taught me that value isn't about what you used to be able to do. It's about what you can still offer, even when your body is failing and the world has stopped paying attention. He's 14 years old. He has arthritis. He's going deaf. He can't run anymore, but he can still save lives. He can still make a difference. He can still be a hero. Frank's eyes were wet. "I won't have Winston much longer. The vet says maybe a year, probably less. And I won't be around much longer after that. But what we've started here, the Winston Protocol, this idea that old dogs and old people still have value, still have work to do, that's going to outlive both of us. And that's the best legacy I could hope for." The room erupted in applause. Residents were crying. Staff members were crying. Even Director Wong was wiping his eyes. After the ceremony, a young woman approached Frank. She was maybe 30, with kind eyes and a nervous smile. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm Rachel Morrison. My grandfather was in room 289, the heart attack that Winston alerted to. I remember. How is he?" "He's doing well. Actually, he's back home now, with my parents. But I wanted to thank you. The doctors said if he'd been found even 30 minutes later, he would have died. Winston saved his life. Your dog gave me more time with my grandfather. I can't ever repay that." She pulled out her phone and showed Frank a photo. An elderly man sitting in a garden, smiling, holding a baby. "That's my grandfather meeting his great-granddaughter last month. She was born 6 weeks ago. He got to meet her because of Winston. Because you didn't give up on an old dog everyone said wasn't worth keeping." Frank felt his throat close up. This is what it had all been for. Not the news coverage or the awards or the program that bore Winston's name, but this, one more generation getting to know their grandfather, one more family that got to stay whole a little longer. "Thank you for telling me," Frank managed. "Winston would be pleased. Well, he'd probably just wag his tail and ask for treats, but I'm pleased on his behalf." Rachel laughed and cried at the same time. "Can I say hello to him?" She knelt down and gently stroked Winston's grey muzzle. The old corgi's tail wagged slowly, accepting the affection with the patience of a dog who'd been loved his entire life. 2 years after Frank and Winston first arrived at Sunset Hills on a quiet Tuesday morning, Winston passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 15 years old. He'd been sleeping in his favorite spot, on Frank's bed, in the patch of sunlight that came through the window every afternoon. Frank woke from a nap to find Winston had simply stopped breathing. There was no struggle, no pain, just a quiet transition from life to death, the way all beings hope to go. Frank held Winston's body and cried like he hadn't cried since Susan died. He cried for his friend, for his partner, for the dog who'd given him purpose when he thought his life was meaningless. He cried for all the time they'd had together, and all the time they'd never have. But most of all, he cried because he was grateful. Grateful that he'd fought to keep Winston when everyone said to give him up. Grateful for every night Winston had alerted, every life he'd saved, every moment of meaning they'd found together. The funeral was held at Sunset Hills. Over 200 people came. Residents, staff, volunteers, people whose lives Winston had saved, trainers from the Winston Protocol program, media covering the story. They held it in the garden where Winston had loved to sit in the sun. Eleanor gave the eulogy. Winston was a good dog, but more than that, he was a reminder of something we'd forgotten. That value isn't measured in productivity, or youth, or perfection. That the last chapters of life can be the most meaningful if we're brave enough to keep showing up. Winston showed up every night. He did his rounds, checked on his people, alerted when something was wrong. He never retired, never gave up, never stopped caring. He worked until the day he died, because the work mattered and the people mattered. What better legacy could anyone leave? They buried Winston's ashes in the garden, under a flowering cherry tree that would bloom every spring. The marker read, Winston Sullivan, 2009 to 2024. He taught us that age is not the end of purpose, that being old is not the same as being worthless, and that sometimes the most valuable lives are lived by those the world has decided to throw away. After Winston's death, Frank expected to fall back into purposelessness. What was he supposed to do now? The program that bore Winston's name would continue. There were now 43 dogs placed in facilities across 12 states. But Frank's role had always been intertwined with Winston's presence. How could he be the face of the Winston Protocol without Winston? Eleanor had an answer. You adopt another old dog. You show people that Winston wasn't a one-time miracle. You prove that senior dogs can do this work and that senior people can still contribute. You keep going, Frank. That's what Winston would do. So at 69 years old, Frank went to the shelter. He looked at all the senior dogs, the 8-year-olds, the 10-year-olds, the 12-year-olds with grey muzzles and cloudy eyes and bodies that moved slowly, but hearts that still wanted to love and be loved. He adopted a 9-year-old beagle mix named Scout, who'd been at the shelter for 6 months. Nobody wanted an older dog who was a little overweight, a little deaf, a little set in her ways. But Frank saw potential. He saw what Scout could become with training, with purpose, with someone willing to invest in her. It took 6 months, but Scout learned. She had the nose, the instinct, the sensitivity. She wasn't Winston. Nobody could be Winston. But she was herself, and she was valuable, and she saved her first life when she was 9.5 years old, alerting to a resident having a stroke. Frank kept working. He traveled less now. His own arthritis was getting worse, his energy fading. But he trained dogs, mentored new handlers, spoke at conferences via video. He wrote a book about Winston that became a surprise bestseller, with all proceeds going to the Winston Protocol program. On his 72nd birthday, Frank received a letter from the governor. The Winston Protocol had been recognized as a model program and was being expanded statewide with government funding. Hundreds of senior dogs would be trained. Hundreds of facilities would receive alert dogs. Thousands of lives would be saved. "We did it, buddy," Frank said that night, sitting by Winston's memorial in the garden with Scout at his feet. "We showed them that old dogs and old people still matter, that we're not done yet, that there's still work to be done, and we're the ones to do it." Scout wagged her tail, then put her head on Frank's knee. In the fading light, Frank could almost see Winston sitting there too, watching over them both. 3 years after Winston's death, Frank Sullivan died quietly in his sleep at age 72. He was in room 247 at Sunset Hills, the room he'd hated when he first arrived but had come to think of as home. Scout was sleeping on his bed. Eleanor found them both in the morning. Frank had passed peacefully, and Scout was keeping vigil, the way dogs do when their person is gone. Frank's funeral was held in the same garden where Winston was buried. His children spoke about a father who'd seemed to disappear after their mother died, who'd been just marking time, just waiting for the end. And then, at 67, he'd found purpose again. He'd become an advocate, an activist, a hero. He'd lived more in his last 5 years than in the previous 10. "Dad used to say that Winston saved his life," Jennifer said, crying. "But I think it was more than that. I think Winston gave Dad permission to believe he still mattered, that he wasn't just taking up space. That age didn't mean obsolete." She looked out at the crowd. Hundreds of people, many of them elderly, many with dogs at their feet. The Winston Protocol has saved lives, but it's also given people like my dad a reason to keep living. It's shown the world that our elders have value, that their experience and wisdom and capacity for love don't disappear just because their bodies are slowing down. That's Dad's real legacy, not just the dogs he trained or the facilities he helped, but the idea that we all have something to offer until the very end. They buried Frank's ashes next to Winston's, under the cherry tree. Scout, now 12 years old, lay between the two graves for an hour after everyone else had left, saying her own goodbye. Eleanor adopted Scout after Frank died. The two old women, one human, one canine, continued Frank's work for 3 more years, until Scout passed away at 15, and Eleanor decided it was finally time to retire. By then, the Winston Protocol had become a national program. There were chapters in 40 states, with over 300 dogs placed in facilities. The program had expanded beyond assisted living to include hospice care, memory care, and even some hospitals. Senior dogs, who might have been euthanized, were instead becoming heroes, and elderly residents, who might have been forgotten, were becoming handlers, trainers, advocates. Every dog in the program wore a tag with Winston's photo and the words, "Age is not the end of purpose." 10 years after Frank first arrived at Sunset Hills with a dog nobody wanted, the facility held a memorial ceremony. They unveiled a life-sized bronze statue in the garden, an elderly man sitting on a bench with a Corgi at his feet, both of them looking out at the world with dignity and purpose. The plaque underneath read, "Frank Sullivan and Winston, 2 old souls who refused to be invisible. They taught us that value isn't measured in youth or productivity, but in the courage to keep showing up, the wisdom to notice what others miss, and the love that endures beyond the body's failing." May all who come here remember, you are never too old to make a difference. You are never past your purpose. You are never done becoming who you were meant to be. Age is not the end of purpose. It's the beginning of wisdom. At the ceremony, Jennifer Sullivan, now in her 50s, stood with her grandchildren and told them about their great-grandfather, who'd seemed so sad and lost after Grandma Susan died, but who'd found meaning again in the last place anyone expected. The world told Papa Frank he was done, Jennifer said, too old to matter, too broken to contribute, and for a while he believed them. But then he met Winston, and Winston showed him the truth, that being old just means you've survived, and survival is its own kind of heroism. She looked at the statue, tears in her eyes. I wish he could see this, see how many lives he changed, see that his story mattered. But Eleanor, now 92 and still living at Sunset Hills, touched Jennifer's arm gently. He knows, wherever he is, whatever comes after, he knows. And Winston's there with him, still keeping watch, still doing his rounds, still showing everyone that even in death, purpose continues. The ceremony ended with a procession of dogs, all the current Winston protocol dogs from facilities across the region, walking through the garden with their handlers. Young dogs and old dogs, purebreds and mutts, all of them wearing tags that identified them as medical alert companions, all of them living proof that Frank and Winston's legacy had taken root and grown into something beautiful. The last dog in the procession was a 14-year-old Corgi named Winston too, chosen specifically because he looked so much like the original Winston. He walked slowly, arthritically, his grey muzzle and cloudy eyes marking him as elderly. But his tail was up, his bearing proud, and when he reached the statue, he sat down beside it and barked once, the same soft, alert bark that Winston had perfected. Everyone watching understood. The work continues, the purpose endures, and somewhere, an old man and his old dog are watching, tails wagging, proud of what they started. If this story touched your heart, we have so many more waiting for you. Stories of animals who society discards, finding purpose in unexpected places, of people who refuse to accept that age means irrelevance, of the profound ways that love and loyalty transcend time and death. Subscribe to Second Chance Stories and hit that notification bell so you never miss these powerful reminders that value isn't measured in youth or perfection, that the last chapters of life can be the most meaningful, and that sometimes the most important work is done by those the world has decided to ignore. Share this with someone who's aging, who's feeling invisible, who needs to hear that they still matter. Share it with someone who works with the elderly, who cares for them, who sometimes forgets that behind the failing bodies are people with decades of wisdom and oceans of love still to give. Drop a comment telling us about an elderly person or pet in your life who showed you that age is just a number, that purpose doesn't expire, that mattering isn't reserved for the young. We want to hear your stories of resilience and relevance, because every old dog deserves respect, every elderly person deserves dignity, and every story about refusing to be invisible deserves to be told. Thanks for watching, and remember, you are never too old to make a difference, never too broken to contribute, never past your purpose. Frank and Winston proved that. They proved it when everyone said they were done, and their legacy proves it still. Age is not the end of purpose. It's the beginning of wisdom. That simple truth changed everything for one old man and one old dog. And it might just change everything for you, too.